Hello, this is Brad Carmack, the author of Homosexuality, A Straight BYU Student's Perspective. You're welcome to download my book for free. You can get it at bradcarmack.blogspot.com. You're also welcome to purchase a hard copy by emailing me at homosexualityperspective@yahoo.com. In past videos, I've talked about why same-sex couples can reproduce. I've discussed a little bit about what causes homosexuality, as well as how changeable homosexual orientation is, and I've reviewed some statements by church leaders on what causes homosexual orientation. Today we're going to be making a strong moral case for LDS same-sex marriage. I know when I say that, sometimes those in the LDS audience say such a case doesn't exist, but and I can see why they would feel that way. But the conclusion that homosexual conduct is sinful doesn't necessarily end the inquiry. By way of comparison, we could look back at the Garden of Eden and know that it was a sin, a breach of the commandments to partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but nevertheless it ended up being a moral thing to do because the contradicting moral duty predominated. So in order to find out whether same-sex marriage, and since it probably involves, in many if not all cases, homosexual conduct, whether or not that's moral or not is not resolved by concluding whether or not homosexual conduct is sinful. We have to look into the other side and see if there is a predominating moral duty. Just to let you know where I'm coming from, I'm an active, believing Latter-day Saint. I do have a firm testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ, of the reality of the first vision, and of the fact that this gospel has been restored. And I do believe in the restoration. I've always had a very special appreciation for the Book of Mormon. Right now we're doing a Book of Mormon challenge in my ward, and I've enjoyed, as I always have, benefiting from the truths that are there in the Book of Mormon. Now, I'm not going to ask you to adopt the views that will be expressed here. In fact, I'm not even going to conclude as to whether or not same-sex marriage is moral or immoral. I only ask that you will consider the reasons that I'm going to give as I make a strong moral case for LDS same-sex marriage. I ask that you keep an open mind until all the arguments have been made, and then you're, of course, I would invite you to make your own conclusions on the morality of same-sex marriage. I will make the proposal that we should support the same-sex marriages of our homosexual-oriented brothers and sisters, the ones that they choose to forge, and eventually I'm going to name 26 reasons that support a strong moral case for LDS same-sex marriage, and I will illustrate a number of them in this video and some additional ones in a subsequent video. So the first strong reason for LDS same-sex marriage, again, this is the idea that we should support the marriages that are forged by our homosexual-oriented brothers and sisters who choose to enter into a same-sex relationship that's long-term and committed. The first reason to support this is that homosexual orientation is not all about lust. And this is, I can see why it's difficult. Of course, homosexual orientation has the word sexual in it, so we tend to think that homosexuality is about sex and about erotic desires and about lust. But homosexual orientation is no more about lust than heterosexual orientation is. Homosexual orientation is about a constellation of romantic, sexual, emotional feelings and attractions towards members of the same gender rather than the opposite. There's been a number of, I call them lustifications, or statements which paint homosexual orientation as being all about lust, that have been made by members and leaders of the church. But more recently, this is a quote from last year, the church recognizes that those of its members who are attracted to those of the same sex experience deep emotional, social, and physical feelings. So homosexual orientation is not all about lust. A way to illustrate this is to think of the relationship of a man and a woman that you know that are married and have children. I think of my own mother and father. I think of the love that my father has for my mother and the love and support that my mother gives to my father. Within my mother is a sexual orientation towards men, and again, this is a constellation of romantic, emotional, and physical inclinations, susceptibilities, attractions towards members of the opposite sex, and she's chosen to direct that orientation towards loving and supporting my father and strengthening their relationship. And the fact that she's made this choice has brought immeasurable blessings to me and to my siblings. And so the question is, what if her sexual orientation were instead housed inside of a man's body? So say that instead my mother was a man. Would she be any less capable of directing her orientation towards loving and supporting my father and loving and supporting her children? Would she be any less capable of being my father's helpmeet, of staying by my father's bedside when he's sick, of making countless meals for him and for the family, of standing by him through thick and thin, of keeping her marital vows, and even of strengthening the relationship in sexual ways, if my father were oriented towards men as well, of making concessions for things that she doesn't want. For instance, if her husband wanted to go on a lot of wilderness treks and she was more wanted to stay in the suburbs, going along with him and supporting him in his desires at her own sacrifice. Those are all things that my mother could do, whether she was a woman or a man. When it comes to that marital relationship and the choice to channel one's orientation into a stable, long-term committed marriage, gender has very little to do with the ability to make that choice. Now, just as there's a kind of a distribution between asexual on the one hand and hypersexual on the other, this same sort of distribution, you might reasonably conclude, applies to both homosexual and heterosexual relationships. So some people are very hypersexual, some just aren't very sexual at all. And that applies to both homosexual-oriented and heterosexual-oriented people. There's no real reason to conclude that homosexual orientation is more about sex or less about sex than heterosexual orientation is. And there's a quote here. It says, "The need for us to be open on the issue of homosexual choice is especially strong, since in contrast to fear, anger, greed, or any of a number of negative characteristics to be resisted and overcome, love for another human being is a fundamentally positive and noble attribute." And that kind of gets at the key of the issue here, that homosexual orientation is not all about lust. In fact, it can be about love to the same extent that heterosexual orientation can. And a lot of times you hear homosexual orientation and behavior compared to other negatives, things like having a bad temper, being alcoholic, having a problem with pornography or gambling or being covetous or using drugs. But we wouldn't compare heterosexual orientation to these things. And so it makes little sense to compare homosexual orientation to these things. I'll read a quote here. I think it's from Clay Jenkins. And again, you can follow along with all these quotes and indeed along with all the things I'm saying in chapter 5 of my book. So here's the quote. "Homosexuality is no less a complex interplay of emotions, affections, identity, needs, aspirations, and sexuality than is heterosexuality. For most of the homosexuals I know, the feelings for one another are the most deep, warm, genuine expressions of love and compassion that two human beings are capable of sharing." And here's what another one said. This is another quote. It says, "It's common to hear the advice, even if you're homosexual, you don't have to act on your homosexual feelings. And the unspoken assumption in the sentiment is that what a homosexual experience is lust." And this is continuing the quote. "But what are the essential healthy feelings of a gay person? As with heterosexuals, they are love, respect, admiration, or infatuation for another human being. They are the natural feelings that accompany the dreams of becoming a spouse or partner. They are a love for children and a hope for security, solidarity, and sanctity of a family. They are the feelings that we all, heterosexual and homosexual alike, share in common as human beings." Now, those that aren't really acquainted with gay people, and this has included myself about 3 or 4 years ago, it's not uncommon to kind of presume that the romantic feelings they have are about, it's all about sex. It's a sexual nature sort of a thing. But homosexual people have romantic feelings as well for those of the opposite sex. Falling in love can have the same positive emotional, spiritual, moral qualities for them as it can for heterosexual love and heterosexual romance. And what we see characterized by homosexual relationships, there's a quote here. It says, "Homosexual love is not counterfeit. What do Latter-day Saints and others who are in a committed gay relationship do? They get up in the middle of the night to care for a sick partner. They fix dinner out of turn when the person they love has had a bad day. They sacrifice in order to provide opportunities for the growth and development of their children. They resist the temptation to be unfaithful. They send flowers. They coach Little League baseball teams. They say, 'I'm sorry.' They help them buy in the groceries. They plant flowers and mow the lawn. They delight in the success and achievement of the one to whom they are devoted, and they do their best to express the deepest feelings of their heart when they say, 'I love you.'" And this is not at all like what I used to think of what homosexual relationships are and what they're all about. So that's the first reason. Homosexual love is not counterfeit. It's not all about lust any more than heterosexual orientation is about lust. Though, of course, there are those that are heterosexual oriented that relationships are all about sex for them. It's no more so than for homosexual oriented people than for heterosexual oriented people. So the second reason to support LDS same-sex marriage centers around the idea of the family, and we're going to parse this into two different reasons. This section will be about the substance of the family. The next reason, number 3, will be about the form of the family. Okay? So the family form has basically two prongs. There are two genders, and there are two partners. And the core institution of the family is the marriage. Even if no kids are ever brought in, say the couple's infertile or something, the Doug and Jenny Larson family is no less a family. And there's a quote here: "Marriage, to be sure, is not instituted solely for procreation." As a side note, we addressed this a little bit in a previous video talking about the ability of same-sex couples to reproduce. It says, "Rather, its very nature is an unbreakable contract between two persons, demand that the mutual love of the spouses two be embodied in a rightly ordered manner, that it grow and ripen. Therefore, marriage persists as a whole manner and communion of life, and maintains its value and indissolubility even when offspring are lacking, despite rather often the very intense desire of the couple." There's an LDS feminist, well-known author, Valerie Hudson, that says that reproduction is the fruit, not the root of marriage. And so even infertile marriages are marriage, whether or not children ever come in. And I think that one of the key aspects of what the substance of marriage is, what its real meaning is, has to do with the unity of the couple. There's a well-known family science LDS author. He said this definition of marriage. He said, "United spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically, taking full responsibility for nurturing each other, they are truly married." I think one of the most important functions of marriage is to abandon the me identity and to adopt a we identity. When you get married, it's less about you and it's more about gaining an identity as a couple. And same-sex couples are just as capable of this union as are opposite-sex couples. There was a declaration in 2004 called the Safe Space Declaration. I'm going to quote 2 paragraphs from that declaration. It says, "We believe that the focus on sexual orientation obscures the real underlying issues of sexual sin, which are founded on lust, greed, and sexual exploitation, which is found among heterosexuals and homosexuals everywhere. We stand for the institution of the family as the embodiment of love and commitment. The presence of a father, mother, and children living together is no guarantee of family success. The presence of true love and commitment within a family is a much better indicator. We believe that all families, regardless of the gender of those involved, should receive wholehearted sanction from our church." Kind of the idea here is that it's the love and commitment and the union of the spouses that is really at the heart and substance of marriage. The opposite genderness of marriage is much farther afield from the core of the institution. And the important aspect to remember here too as well, and why this argument about the substance of family supporting same-sex marriage, is that celibacy and promiscuity, which are often the available alternatives for homosexual-oriented people, they don't deliver a family experience. Homosexual marriage does deliver a family experience. And because of the importance of a family experience during mortality, we should encourage both. And because there are so many risks, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, to mixed orientation marriages, where one spouse is homosexual oriented and the other spouse of the opposite gender is heterosexual oriented, because of the risks that are endemic to those relationships, although some of them do work out, and we'll talk more about that. Same-sex marriage really is the most intuitive vehicle through which to deliver a family experience in general to homosexual-oriented people. Now let's talk a little bit more about this issue from, again, this idea of family. We're still on reason number 2, the substance of family as a reason to support LDS same-sex marriage. What choices does a homosexually-oriented LDS member have in regards to marriage? Well, they have primarily 4 lifestyle choices. 1, they can be heterosexually married, so mixed orientation marriage usually. 2, they can have fidelity to a single same-sex partner. 3, they can be celibate for their whole lives. Or 4, they can be homosexually promiscuous. And as I'm sure most of the audience are aware, there's a strong cultural pressure, both in and out of the church, but especially in the church, to marry. And homosexuals feel that pressure just as heterosexuals do. And very often it leads homosexual members of the church to marry someone of the opposite gender. There was a study, I'll quote from a quote here. It says that there was an LDS homosexual group of 136. 71% were returned missionaries, and 36% had tried marriage. They'd been married an average of 9 years and had an average of 2.5 children, and only 2 of the 36 were still married at the time of the survey. There's a LDS counselor who's counseled in a large number of mixed orientation marriages, and she says, "I can count on both hands the couples I have worked with who have chosen to stay married with the goal of managing the difficulties and enriching their experience with each other and their children. I have talked to many women and several men who felt left out of discussions of future ramifications, even if they knew about the same-sex attraction prior to the marriage." Amity Burton, this is still a quote, Amity Burton, author of The Other Side of the Closet, discusses the trauma, silence, and loss of integrity that occur as one spouse comes out of the closet. Effectively, when the gay partner comes out of the closet, the straight one often goes in. The feeling of invisibility and of not being loved or cherished increases for most spouses. There's another quote from Wayne Scow, again talking about some of the risks and benefits of mixed orientation marriages. These mixed marriages seem much more likely to end in divorce, or if they remain intact, are much less likely to provide marital satisfaction to both partners. Indeed, their negative outcomes typically cause pain and suffering for all involved, not least to the children of such unions. Nor is it in society's best interest to perpetuate such suffering. Would it not be fairer and more humane to legitimize a form of marriage that is more realistically attuned to the uniqueness of the individuals involved? And I've witnessed this as well with individuals that I know that are recently divorced, or some that are involved in mixed orientation marriages, some of the difficulties that they experience, and oftentimes the intense pain and suffering that comes, especially with divorce, which is a greater risk for those in more mixed orientation marriages compared to opposite sex marriages or the same orientation marriages. And there's also a well-known Craigslist culture in Utah and Salt Lake counties, for instance, where sealed LDS men, when the wife and children are away, you've heard the phrase, when the cat's away, the mice play. They have men come over and they mess around while their wife and children are away. And this practice hints at the duplicity that's often evident in these mixed orientation marriages. And a lot of times, in order to engage in sexual intercourse, the gay men in some of these mixed orientation marriages, they fantasize about men when they're having sex with their wives. Or after they have sex with their wives, they go to the bathroom and throw up because of how difficult it is for them. There are definitely risks that are associated that are elevated for mixed orientation marriage compared to opposite sex marriage. Now, another part of the substance of marriage, would talk about why that's important and why we believe in that, I believe as Latter-day Saints, is because of how marriage can help us to become like God. The idea is theosis. It's unique to LDS theology. There are some other theologies, especially in the past, that have been had a focus on theosis, but it's not as prevalent in today's religions, but it's very strongly prevalent in the LDS theology that we want to become as God is. And we believe that family life provides a very important step or training ground to attain that God-like status. So to become unified with the spouse is something that we believe that God has done, that we tried to emulate him in doing. And also, I'm going to kind of say, what is the message that some homosexual-oriented people hear in the church? Well, they know how important family is, the importance of losing that me identity and gaining a we identity in order to be able to enter God's kingdom, in order to become like him. And so they realize that they're homosexual-oriented. The more recent counsel of the church is that those who cannot control their attractions shouldn't enter opposite-sex marriages, especially if the spouses don't understand what they're going into. You can get that from the Oaks Wickman Address in 2006. And obviously same-sex marriage is out of the question for these homosexual-oriented LDS people. And so they kind of realize that they can't really begin progressing substantively towards becoming like God until they die and are resurrected as a person with a heterosexual orientation. It basically kind of comes down to this message that you're not good enough to take big strides toward becoming like God now, but if you were lucky enough to get hit by a bus or something and then get radically changed into a more God-conducive version of yourself, one that's heterosexual-oriented, then you could start progressing on that path. But if you don't, then you've got to endure decades of relative loneliness, lack of intimacy, self-repression, in the hope that one day maybe you'll die and be released from your homosexual orientation. Obviously, that's not the message that all homosexual-oriented members of the church feel or hear, but it is one that many of them hear. And when I talk to homosexual-oriented members of the church, especially or ones that have recently left, especially one that are men, oftentimes these are sort of the messages that they hear. And of course, a number of them that I know have attempted suicide, usually as adolescents. and of course some, as we know, have succeeded. And that's a very dangerous message, one that I think that we should all be concerned about. The idea that, also I mentioned the 2006 Oakes-Wickman address, the idea that homosexual orientation is for mortality only might open up the way to having a mortality-only remedy or accommodation for those that are homosexual oriented. For instance, if we're willing to kind of throw up our hands and say, God will work it out in the afterlife in some difficult situations, say that there's a child with serious Down syndrome or a woman who goes through life without receiving a marriage proposal, why not carve out another sort of short of eternal marriage accommodation for the homosexual oriented, perhaps an accommodation that would encourage greater obedience to the law of chastity, which is not only about restricting your sexual behavior to somebody of the opposite gender, it's also about cleaving to a single person. It's also about behaving with fidelity. Those are also important elements of the law of chastity. And it seems that in as far as the moral calculus goes, if the promiscuous homosexual behavior is morally equivalent to same-sex behavior with a single committed partner, which both of them have the same sort of ramifications or consequences, they're both considered sort of equally sinful, it seems that promiscuous homosexual behavior is more immoral than sexual behavior only with a single spouse or a single partner, a lifetime committed partner that has to do with love and unity. But it's difficult for homosexual people to want to trod path A versus path B, one partner versus many, if they're both deemed equally immoral. And I think that we want to try to encourage as much moral behavior as we can. Now, the Church's teachings are very appropriate for the heterosexual majority, but how is a homosexual-oriented member supposed to have faith in the ability of the Church to help him or her be happy during mortality? I mean, certainly there's the promise of happiness and being prosperity after mortality when they die, but this is a quote from Joseph F. Smith. He says, "It has always been a cardinal teaching within the Latter-day Saints that a religion which has not the power to save people temporally and make them prosperous and happy here cannot be depended upon to save them spiritually, to exalt them in the life to come." Now, a life of celibacy, of relative loneliness, of watching your heterosexual peers marry and raise children, while you're deprived of the experience of being united with the spouse and of the possibility of parenting, I would argue is not as prosperous and happy as it could be, and might cause some, and indeed has caused a number of homosexual-oriented members of the Church to question the ability of the LDS faith and theology and of the atonement to help make them prosperous and happy in the life to come, because it lacks the power to make them prosperous and happy here like their heterosexual counterparts. I'll close with one more quote and a closing statement here, and it'll conclude the first two reasons, and then the next video will continue with the third reason. Here's the quote. "Homosexual Latter-day Saints realize that marriage is not an end in itself. It is not sought as a badge of honor, to spite society or out of any other questionable motive. Rather, marriage, regardless of sexual orientation, is used as a relationship between people who love one another, one that permits both to begin to acquire those godly traits that we all hope to develop during our mortal experience: unselfishness, kindness, forgiveness, sacrifice, service to others, and fidelity, to name just a few. And as a people, we argue forcefully that no other institution is able to foster these characteristics as effectively, and as we are taught, mortality is the most effective period for that to be achieved." Now, the Church's God Loveth His Children pamphlet points out that singing hymns, listening to uplifting talks, and partaking the sacrament all contribute to your spiritual growth, but when the general authorities speak about happiness, they always couch it in terms of spouse and children, and they teach about the central role of the family in God's plan for mortality. And President Hinckley once, in comparing service and other endeavors outside the home to motherhood, I'm going to break my commitment here and do another quote. He said, "There's no other thing that will compare with that," meaning motherhood, "regardless of what she does." Similarly, David O. McKay said, "There is no success which can compensate for failure in the home." And I would argue that this principle includes homosexual-oriented people. No other success can compensate for failure to have a home, I would say, meaning a spouse and the possibility of children. And so even though homosexual-oriented people are counseled to love and focus on service and other non-family aspects of life, it's clear that the sum of all these other activities will never approach the eternal utility of even a modest dose of spouse, being a spouse or parenting, and becoming one as united in a marriage. And so, because family is central to the Creator's plan for his children during mortality, the substance of family, which is that unity in marriage, is a strong argument for same-sex marriage. So that concludes the first two reasons that homosexual orientation is not all about lust, and the substance or core elements of the family being marriage and the unity therein. Next, we're going to talk about family, the form, and the structure of family.